This session is a little different today. It's interesting, I was being interviewed by KDOW this morning. And in the middle of the interview, we were talking about what's going on in Asia and in Asian entrepreneurship and Asian innovation. And the host, Alan Olson, said, "So what does Asia innovation mean for the Silicon Valley?" And that's exactly the theme of our talk today, right? We've got 3 Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. And their ventures, as we'll hear, are really Silicon Valley ventures. But we're looking for the Asia connections. What is it about Asia that has influenced either the pattern of procuring funding or other resources for the venture or the whole market opportunity for the venture, or even possibly just the cultural background that may be, you know, in some ways, all of our panel are international people. I'm very happy that we have a great panel today. Sitting closest to me is David Brunner, and I've known David for about 14 years since he was a student at Stanford. And since being a student at Stanford and one of the organizers of the very first Asia Pacific Student Entrepreneurship Society summits at Stanford. David went on to get a doctorate from Harvard University, and also to write about entrepreneurship in Japan, and is now in the middle of the angel round, the first round of a venture here. Sitting next to David is Jim Nguyen, and Jim was a contact from several years ago. We've been on some of the same programs together, but I want to say especially that Jim was recommended to me for this session by Jeremy Potash, who is the Executive Director of the California Asia Business Council. So I want to thank Jeremy for her help in putting this seminar together today. And I especially want to say thanks to Jim for coming over and talking to us. He will present his current venture, which is Kynded.com, Kynded.com. And farthest away from me is Yukai Chou, who's been on a number of our programs before. Yukai is really a serial entrepreneur, having done several ventures in the Silicon Valley area, coming from Taiwan to the US, right? And Yukai, until recently, was the CEO of a company called RewardMe. And he's really an expert in the whole area of gamification. So I think we've got a great panel. What I'm going to ask is for each of our panelists in turn to kind of give prepared remarks. While you're giving prepared remarks, we'll sit down and watch your slides, okay? David, why don't you go first?
Okay. Could we bring up the my slides?
That's it.
No, actually, these are.
Oh. What?
Let's see. Maybe we have.
Did I get the wrong set?
Yeah. So mine is the Acrobat one.
Yeah, that's right.
Should be on.
Of course.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's all right. It does work better with the right slides.
There we go. And we can start the presentation.
Okay, there you go.
Good afternoon. My name is David Brunner, as per Richard's generous introduction. So let me start with just a few words about myself. I am a local Silicon Valley boy, born and raised in Los Altos. My father bounced around startups, so I heard over dinner table conversations about VCs and Sand Hill Road and all that stuff before coming to Stanford. I came to Stanford. I did an undergraduate degree in computer science. Along the way, I became interested in Japan. I stopped out for a year and went to Shizuoka University on a Ministry of Education scholarship. And then I joined the Tokyo office of the Boston Consulting Group. I actually got an offer from the San Francisco office. I said, you know, I'd really like to start in Japan. And they said, you can't do that. And I said, please. And they said, okay, go talk to the partners in Tokyo and see if they'll let you. And they were kind enough to let me start there, which was probably the most difficult experience in my life, with the possible exception of my current venture. So I started in Tokyo. I then came back to San Francisco. And after doing that for 2 years, I went on to get my doctorate in a PhD program at Harvard that was joint between computer science and business. Unfortunately, it no longer exists anymore, but it was the program in information technology and management. I wrote a dissertation that I called Computer-Assisted Organizing. After finishing that off, I thought about going into academia, but realized I couldn't really focus on IT because none of the top-tier business schools really have IT departments. And although I'm an organization theorist by training, I wasn't willing to give up the Japan and the IT angles. So I hung around Harvard for a year as a researcher. Along the way, and this I'll talk about it more in a moment, I got connected with Shinsei Bank in Tokyo. I worked with them sort of as a researcher, sometimes in residence, studying their enterprise IT systems. I connected with the Tokyo Foundation, where I'm currently a visiting fellow working on their project on corporate governance and corporate social responsibility. And most recently, I'm the CEO and founder of moduleQ, which I launched in 2011. We raised a seed round in 2011-12. We're now raising a bridge round, which we hope will close next Friday. I don't want to jinx that, but so far so good. Richard mentioned that I have some connections to Japanese entrepreneurship. Let me touch on that just briefly. While an undergrad, I connected with Professor Edward Feigenbaum, who is in the audience with us today, who took me to Japan, my second trip to Japan to do research on Japanese entrepreneurship. We wrote a book together on the Japanese entrepreneur and the troubles they face. And I'm actually rather nervous standing up here because in the manuscript for that book, I had some embarrassing spelling errors, and he threatened to call up the university and have my degree revoked. So I hope we won't have too many errors in my slides today, or I may lose some of my credentials. But after graduating and finishing my time at BCG, I spent a summer working with the Kyoto prefectural government on entrepreneurship promotion. Some of you may recognize the Kyoto prefecture flag up there if you're Japan buffs. And learned that if there is going to be an entrepreneurial rebirth in Kyoto, it will not be driven by the Kyoto prefectural government. And a few other things more recently. I'll just mention one because it has to do with these Asia connections. My dear friend Izumo, who was a participant in the first Asia Pacific Student Entrepreneurship Summit here at Stanford, has been an inspiration to me throughout my career. That's him selling a Euglena latte as part of his startup in Japan. Euglena is an algae that can be converted into jet fuel, and the Euglena latte is milk with algae mixed in. So I'll let you think about that one. So let me now talk just briefly. Yeah, I forgot the punchline of that story, actually. Euglena went public in December. They're now valued, as of yesterday, at about $1.5 billion. I follow them pretty closely. So the problem that we've set out to solve at moduleQ is a problem around email. So email was never designed to be a process management technology, but it's used de facto to manage just about every ad hoc or ill-structured business process. And so what we're doing with moduleQ is building a layer over email that integrates into email and helps you keep track of what's going on. So keep using email for the stuff that doesn't matter, but if it matters, put it through moduleQ so it'll be tracked and organized. So you'll get a dashboard, something like this, showing you the balls that are in your court that you need to take action on, the things you've hit to other people and delegated that you're waiting for other people to act on, and everything else. So that's all the pitch I'll give you. I know we have limited time. So I want to move on to how entrepreneurship in Asia fits into this whole story. And so I'm going to give you a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective. The quantitative perspective touches on Richard's comments about fundraising. It has a sample of one, which I will tell you is very unrepresentative of the broader population. But for what it's worth, here's a profile of moduleQ's financing to date. A significant majority of our angel investors either are Japanese or have a connection to Japan. And of the amount of funds, a substantial chunk is from Japanese nationals. I found that if you think well-to-do Japanese individuals are risk-averse, think again. They're a great source of angel financing if you have the relationships, and folks with Japan connections. And the comment that I'll make here, and we might return to this, I'm not sure, later in the panel, is that There is a benefit I have found in fundraising to having access to a diverse pool of prospective investors, especially because here in Silicon Valley, what you're doing today might not be hot, and it might take 2 years until people decide that actually enterprise technology is interesting. When I started moduleQ, nobody wanted to hear about the enterprise, everyone wanted to hear about social networks. Now no one wants to hear about social networks, everyone wants to hear about enterprise. So having that diverse global pool to draw on was pretty helpful. Let me now give you a qualitative view of why I think Asian entrepreneurship matters. This is going to be a little impressionistic, and I won't be able to go into the details, but I want to try to get across this idea that there's some global cross-pollination that can happen with ideas, and that can be really important for startups. So our story starts in India, where an extraordinary individual named Jay Dwivedi got his degree in industrial engineering, and then in part because of his large posture or large frame and experience crushing unions, got recruited by Citibank to protect their banks in a war zone in the Middle East, which taught him that he could go around Citibank solving their difficult problems. So he moved on to Switzerland and then Japan and ran into a guy named Masamoto Yashiro, who turned out to be the guy that Ripplewood Holdings tapped when they needed a CEO to run the collapsed long-term credit bank of Japan, which they resuscitated as Shinsei Bank. And if you're interested in our story up to this point, I strongly recommend Saving the Sun by Gillian Tett, a great book about this story in which both Jay and Yashiro-san feature prominently. After Yashiro-san resigned, a Harvard man by the name of Terry Porte took over. He took a look at what Jay was doing in IT and didn't really understand it. Actually, nobody really understands Jay, but that seems to be part of the brilliance. But Jay managed to take the bank from mainframes to off-the-shelf Dell servers in less than a year on under $50 million US, when audited quotes were saying 500 million, with no screw-ups. And so Terry said to the folks at Harvard, you might want to take a look at this, and some Harvard Business School researchers wrote a great article called Radically Simple IT, which has been an inspiration to me. And one of the co-authors was a doctoral student named Brad Stotz, who was a colleague of mine, and said, David, you should really get to know Jay. So you can see there's lots of things bouncing around here. So I went out to Japan and got to know Jay, and also got to know his lieutenant, Peter Franken, who went to Japan, a Dutchman who went to Japan after college to work on the Fifth Generation project, which Professor Feigenbaum wrote a book about. And he loves Japan and loves technology, and so after the tsunami, he started an organization called Safecast, hacking together iPod Geiger counters that let you measure radiation with your iPhone and do crowdsourced radiation measurements. And they've just created the first, at least to my knowledge, Geiger counter drone. So Peter happens to be good friends with Ian McFarlane, who is the former chief technology officer at a company called Pivotal Labs, now is affiliated with Digital Garage, which is Joey Ito's company in Japan, and now with a San Francisco office, connected with Neo, and that brings you back to us because Neo will very likely do the development of our iOS app or help with that. So the punchline to this long and winding story is that everyone here was somehow reached their goals through some kind of entrepreneurial endeavor. Their paths all led in some way through Asia, and almost everyone that I've talked about has in some way been essential to the creation and growth of moduleQ up to this point, either by providing ideas, advice, or capital. So for almost everyone I showed you, I could tell a long story about how they were critical in the process. I can't, given our time constraints, but I hope you get the idea that there's just a lot of cross-pollination that can go on. So with that, I'll conclude, and I look forward to taking your questions in the panel.
Thanks, David. While I set up for the next person as you're on the way down, let me ask you a quick follow-up. Do
Sure.
you think that kind of amazingly global background more common?
I think it's absolutely more and more common because the way that these people work together and the way that they create their global connections could not have happened without IT. We routinely collaborate on Skype. We work long distance across continents. My investor pool is distributed around the world. My advisors are distributed around the world. And these individuals work that way too. So people have gotten used to telepresence as a substitute for actual presence, and they've gotten used to having a global expertise supply chain.
Okay. let's call it an end for this from now and ask Jim Nguyen, if you'll come up and give us some.
Is there a way for me to turn this off or it turns off?
They'll take care of it. They'll turn you down.
Hi everyone, my name is Jim Nguyen. I'm the co-founder and president of Kynded. Very glad to be here. I want to recognize some people in the room. I have my CFO, Elizabeth Pierce, here. I have my 2 students from Germany who I'm teaching culture management. We finished with our finals, but they came here to listen to me. So thanks for coming. Thanks, Dr. Richard Dasher, for inviting me, and appreciate the opportunity. You know, when Richard called me and say, hey, I'm counting on you to come in and give a talk, I made a checklist of things that he wants to make sure that I check off, you know, when I talk, right? And so in my brief remarks, you will see that hopefully I will touch all these points. You know, did I receive funding from Asian sources? Yes. Benefits from the networks of business contacts in Asia? Yes. Do I see an opportunity in Asia markets for companies like myself? Yes. And you know, what are the recognized elements of Asia culture as having influenced my path as an entrepreneur? Also, yes. Okay? So we go through this. So, you know, I began my career after college working for the mayor of San Francisco. I was doing my MBA over at St. Mary's, and I had this idea that, hey, you know, San Francisco, Vietnam is still under the embargo. You know, what can we do to set up a relationship with Vietnam? And sort of like, you know, San Francisco is always the pioneer in opening up relations with, you know, with difficult government. And I learned through my research that San Francisco send, you know, business people, send people who do humanitarian work to Vietnam at the time, and all was under the radar. And so I wrote to the mayor, I said, you know, and my boss, and I said, you know, is there any way that we can set up a sister city with Saigon, with Ho Chi Minh City? And they invited me in, and within 6 months, I was brought on board. And I was a rising star because I came in and I set up the program from scratch, and you know, I was known as, you know, writing speeches for the mayor when he goes to Southeast Asia and stuff like that. And I thought my career was riding high, right? I became sort of like the Vietnam expert in the mayor's office and throughout the Bay Area. And one day I woke up and this happened. My mayor, let me see if I can play. My mayor was, through a dare, you know, a stunt, right? Took a picture with 2 radio jockeys in the shower. And I thought, oh my God, so there goes my career. So with the new mayor on board, he changed policy. Of course, we still have the sister relationship with Saigon, but he exiled me to the Ferry Building. I don't know if you've ever been to the Slanted Door, this big Vietnamese restaurant in the Ferry Building. That was where our office was, and I was only 2 people left from the previous administration, and he and I were invited back only like around, you know, staff meeting every Tuesday at 9 o'clock. Other than that, we were not welcome. That was when I had this idea that, you know what, I don't like politics. It's really sad and it's oppressive and all that. So I linked up with a friend of mine, and he's now also my co-founder. We started this company called plexusnet. And plexusnet developed these back in the late 90s, from 98 to 2001. If you went to high-tech shows in Vegas, like Comdex Network Interop and Apple One and all that, we developed the back end for these guys. We, at 27, you know, I raised $4.6 million with my co-founder, and we were riding high. Had ended up with 75 people, had office in Hong Kong, Singapore, Boston, and August 2001, I think, everything collapsed. You know, Deutsche Bank called me up and say, hey, Jim, no go. And he and I were the last one to turn off the light. That was a dot bomb. Then I got recruited to work at Mercury News. I was there for close to 3 years. And even during that time, I still have this burning dream of, you know, doing something related to Vietnam, which I jumped at the opportunity after I left the mayor's office. So my first startup after plexusnet was Pops. Pops came into the Vietnam market at the time when it was really difficult for licensing production companies, licensing companies to make any kind of money in Vietnam, because if you download ringtones, ringback tones, full audio songs, it's all pirated, right? We were the first company to go in. We signed license with EMI, with Sony, Universal, and we convinced those guys to do deal with us so that we can go and do deal with the local mobile carriers. And so within a couple of years, we became known as sort of like the music aggregator, the international content aggregator for Vietnam. Because of travel and families, I turned over the company to my partner. She's running it right now, and Pops is really riding high, like #1 in Vietnam in terms of being a mobile. They also making mobile games now, mobile entertainment company. In the first year and a half, I raised $1 million, and we talked about it a little bit, through angels here, and mostly a group of CEOs in the Valley who are Vietnamese Americans who I had some contacts, and I went to them and say, hey, this is really a worthy investment, and you would be very happy to hear that all the companies that they provided seed funding for at the time, they're all gone, and Pops is still standing. So I'm very happy about that. The other $1 million before I left, we raised through a Japanese VC. And it was pretty straightforward, dealing with Japanese investors. But at the time, these Japanese investors didn't want anything to do with US presence. They just want us to be in Vietnam, having a full presence there, and establish the market there. 2012, which is last year, I started a company called Kynded. And go to the next slide, and then we go back to this. It's very, very simple. My daughter left her backpack at the airport, at the San Francisco International Airport last June. And 2 hours later, we came back. Someone found it. One of those parking guys who go around and give you parking tickets. We call them the evil people in San Francisco. He found our backpack, and in there was her iPad, her homework, her camera, and all kinds of stuff. And I wanted to thank the guy, but I didn't have a sufficient way to thank him because I thought a verbal thanks, he'll forget it. I said, if I write a note to your boss, maybe you and your boss will see it. So we came back, I talked to my partner, we called some psychologists, called people like Elizabeth, recruited, really some smart people come in and brainstorm and say, how can we do better? How can we make the thanks last longer? How can we make it more permanent, right? And so we came up with a system called Recognize, Record, and Reward. And this is done through your mobile phone, through a browser. You send a kindogram to whoever was, being kind to you. That's what we're working on right now. Right now, still in beta development. Mid-June, we have a private launch, and we're in the process of raising the bridge round. David sounds like he's very close to closing it. We are about 400K away. The other third company that I'm working on with a friend of mine is, where I'm on the board, is Mosu System, and Mosu is really more in contract manufacturing and design services. Outside of all these things, I teach part-time at City College, cross marketing communications and intercultural management. So what it was like, I talked with David briefly about, I want to give you kind of my personal take on how I dealt with these investors. Just imagine the profile of some of the investors I'm dealing with, right? They're not that sophisticated. A lot of these guys are self-made, millionaire in Vietnam. They went through a very tough time, and these guys are loaded over there, right? And they are looking for ways to park the money here in the US, right? Or they are looking for different kind of ventures for them to invest in, because in Vietnam, these kind of startups where you have a potential global play, doesn't exist, right? Because over there, startup, you build things for your regional market. So to me, going to Vietnamese investors was the quickest way to get seed funding, assuming you have the language, the personal and the community connections, right? I said you must be willing to travel and have thick skin, because these are people who made the money in a very tough way. So you have to know how to navigate the cultural part when you deal with them. HEPI is highly emotional, personal investment. They are not sophisticated. They want the safe way to park their money. And so you need to understand their motivation. You need to understand why they want to invest in your company. They don't care. Maybe they don't care about your software. They don't care about Kynded, but they care about where, to keep the money safe. Many of them, even though they're not sophisticated, when they give you the money, when they invest, they hire one of the best top law firm in San Francisco to deal with us. So their language may not be straightforward, but they prefer structured agreement over handshake. Okay, and because of a personal relationship, they will assert special relationship to drive a better deal. And that is one thing that entrepreneurs, we have to know how to navigate, because it's not that straightforward, and sometimes they take advantage of the personal relationship to try to get more out of you. Because most of them are business owner by themselves, right? They kind of own, they own their own empire. You deal directly with them, right? They have local emissary, but most of the time they really don't have any power. And I say, usually I try to have direct contact with these guys. You may find it strange, but they may ask you to help them with some other business in the U.S. You know, they may have some kind of investment down south. They may have, may want to get their kid a job somewhere. They may need to find an apartment. They need to buy a house. And so when they invest money in us, they also have all these little baggage that we also have to take into account. I say find the people to help you, but don't say no immediately, right? You don't want to say no because they give you money, and you want to find ways to work with them. Karaoke, long dinner, Las Vegas, side trip. That's to be expected. You know, tell your spouse it's just business, right? Many of these guys, when they come here, that's their time to, do serious business, but also to have some fun. And so as entrepreneurs, again, you kind of have to know what their needs, what the motivation, and kind of go along with it. Just don't get in trouble with your wife. Language helps, but it's not a deal breaker. You don't necessarily need to speak Vietnamese or Chinese or, the language of the investor. But I think it's important to team up with someone who is culturally capable to work with you. The culture influence, to me, the influence on me, being Asian and being connected to Vietnam is really, I think risk-taking is in my DNA. And I said probably because of boating, because at 12, I escaped Vietnam by boat. And so when you kind of went through that, you just kind of deal with things and you don't take adversity lying down, right? Maximize personal connections because of the years that I spent in the mayor's office dealing with high-level government. And so I have a very long relationship with these people. I maximize them, but I don't compromise my integrity, right? Because many of them, they kind of have their own agenda. Also see myself as a role model to overseas entrepreneurs. Many of these guys, they because they're not sophisticated, they have this very fantastical notion of what the U.S. Is like. And so I want to be their role model because I want to show them how to do it right. Also, global driven, not country or regional, right? Even though I'm originally from Vietnam, I can develop things for that market. I also see that what I do here has much more of an impact because what I do here has wider reach than if I were in Vietnam. What's the influence on my startup? I think, to us, we don't, when we build Kynded, we think right away, well, how's this going to work for the Vietnam market? How's this going to work for the China market? So it's natural for me to say, hey, Asia is a natural market to start or expand. The work ethics and integrity, that's automatic. Always push my people to build long and lasting relationship with partners, right, with investors. Also, we are very aggressive, very, very aggressive in mining the networks that we have in Vietnam and Asia for investment because, as I'm sure David mentioned, it's about having that immediate access to cash so that you can start your business. We can go over this Q&A, but this is really to answer one of David's to Dr. Dasher's last question is the special opportunity. I believe that many of us, in order to be competitive, we have to be cultural entrepreneur. Not just entrepreneur, but we have to be cultural entrepreneur. We have to be attuned to people of different cultures and how they think, how they operate in order to get things from them, right? We have to build a bridge between Silicon Valley and Asia, right? And that's two ways. Not only getting investment from them to here, inbound, but also getting their investment for your startup if you plan to launch regionally. And to me, the last thing is open up new source of seed funding. When I last talked with David, it's very difficult to get funding here for many, many reasons, right? And so to me, having direct connection to some of the people who are willing to park their cash and they believe in your vision, then it's much easier to get from them. I'll take your Q&A later. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Actually, why don't you stay up front? And David, why don't you come up front? Because this is the last set of slides.
Yukai,
I'm going to ask. Oh, you do have slides.
Really quickly.
All right, then we will use your slides. You got a Mac, right?
Yeah.
All right, we're in business. And do you need sound?
No.
Okay. Great, Yukai, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So after seeing all the pretty slides the past two speakers had, I didn't prepare a slide because this talk is a little bit last moment for me with other schedules and stuff. But I decided I should show something too, just based on my experience. So there's some visual things to go by. So just a quick background on myself. Again, I'm Yukai Chou. As Professor Dash said, I was born in Taiwan, and about high school, I'm 8th grade, and last semester of 8th grade, so I moved to the States, and I moved to Kansas, which was a great place to learn English. Didn't have any Asian friends to really talk to. Actually, it's actually really funny because people there, good friends of mine, not even strangers, they thought I looked exactly like Jackie Chan and Jet Li at the same time, which made no sense, right? And they were really serious, but I started my first company first year in college when I was at UCLA, and I eventually moved on to do a few more, and the last one was Reward Me, so raised a little money. Like I stepped down as CEO about 6-7 months ago, and I talked a little bit about that. And then I'm also a pioneer and an international keynote speaker for gamification, so now I speak about gamification in Denmark, India, Australia, a few other places. And I created the gamification framework called Catalysis. So when I first started my company in college, what I thought was that, before that I spent a lot of time playing games. And I was very obsessed about games. I would try to master every game I played. I would pull out Excel spreadsheets and optimize my game. This skill match with this gear, match with this way. There's actually a community of gamers out there who use Excel spreadsheets to play better. And so we're very, very serious gamers, and we excel the games we play. But eventually you have to quit the game. And well, hopefully, or else when you're like 70 and you're playing that game you're playing when you're 14, it's kind of strange, right? So you eventually have to quit the game. And then I quit a game called Diablo 2, and I just felt, my life felt really empty. I spent thousands of hours mastering this game, and now I have nothing, right? So since then, I became really obsessed with how to combine games with things that are productive, either make games more productive or make life more fun. So I dove into things where how can you use the addictive, fun, exciting nature things of games and incorporate into things that are important. So in college, I started FD World, and basically back then virtual worlds were big. So Second Life, I don't know how many of you guys know about Second Life? All right, decent amount. So Second Life was pretty big. It was a virtual world. People flew around, chat, socialized, and I saw Second Life as the the MySpace of virtual worlds. It's all about self-expression. You can customize everything, but it's a little messy, a little dirty, and a lot of weird things going on here and there.
Yukai,
yes.
Maybe you should grab the microphone.
Oh.
I'm not sure. I'm not getting the back end of make sure we're actually getting.
Oh yeah, cool. Hello?
Yep.
Awesome. I hear my voice. So I thought that, hey, there could be a virtual world that's more of the LinkedIn of its space. Basically, it's not about a fake identity escapism, but more about using a virtual world to lower the barrier of meeting new people, but represent your professional self. You can use that to network, to do career fairs, to even do remote job interviews. So I worked on that. We also explored a few different things like a remote office, like a virtual team kind of project called FD Office. Basically, when you work in a remote team, it almost feels like all your coworkers are just emails, right? And you don't feel like you're part of a culture. So I thought, hey, what would be cool if this was just like a desktop where you're working, but when people log into their computer, it shows the person get on their seat, and you don't have to interact with them, but you kind of see how their mood is at. They're at Tokyo or wherever, and they can, you can chat whenever they want. You can open a whiteboard or open a Skype, directly through that. It just builds a little more culture in that. So these projects, especially one called FD Career, was doing okay. One was rated, I think, one of the top. It was rated as a top 10 social networks for Gen Ys by Mashable, and we had a partnership with Disney. Unfortunately, and the one that had the most steam was something that helped utilize gaming to help companies recruit talent more efficiently. Now, unfortunately, that was when the economy crash of 2008 happened, and every company was looking to lay off everyone they could. So my startup that helped them hire more efficiently wasn't very useful. So we pivoted into a few other things, so social media ranking, virology, and the last thing I was doing is something called Reward Me, which is really trying to bring the power of a loyalty program and also customization, personalization into the offline store and restaurants. And we raised $1 million for that, and we pushed out. We accomplished a good amount of things. And unfortunately, 7 months ago, we had some investor and co-founder issues. So I stepped down as CEO, and I'm not really doing too much with that anymore. And so, but that freed up my time to do what I'm really passionate about, which is gamification. And so I developed a framework called Octalysis, basically really boiling motivation down to 8 core drives. And through those 8 core drives, you can start to figure out what game mechanics and elements you should use, instead of just always saying, hey, we should put on points and badges and leaderboards because we're doing gamification. And so that really took off and was translated in about 7 different languages, which is why I get to fly around the world and just talk about that. So in relation to the topic today, I just have 2 slides with some bullet points. But when it comes to funding, right, I think we talked about that a little earlier. We heard about that earlier. There's a lot of investors, from my knowledge, from China who are very, very wealthy, but they made money through traditional businesses, and they're not very sophisticated with technology startups. But they also value things from the West. So they feel like, hey, if something's from the West, it's great. Technology company, they're great, and they want to figure out what to do with their money. So a lot of them, especially the early days, they come to the States and they're trying to find ways to invest their money in new technologies. And there's some few stories that I quickly want to talk about. But notice that has been shifting lately also. That was extremely the case maybe 5-8 years ago. But now that money is shifting back again into China because they're feeling, hey, we're more sophisticated here now. We learned a lot. We have actually a bigger market. So that is shifting a little bit, which is important. And the example I want to talk about is this company called Telenav. It's a public company. They were one of RewardMe's investors. And they had a really interesting story. So their founder, HP Jin, is from China. And prior he raised a successful round. I think it was he raised $16 million. But then he got into a problem where his funding was running out and he couldn't raise more money. So he lowered his valuation to $3 million, and still no one wanted to give him money. So he started cutting off his employees, going from 75% salary to 25%, to the point where he told everyone, hey, just go home, take a break, and we'll see what happens. So his company was about to die. But then he randomly met a guy from China who was traveling here. And he just talked to the guy about his Telenav, and the guy's like, oh, interesting, how much money do you need? He's like, I need $1 million. So the guy's like, okay, and so the guy gave him $1 million. And so Telenav, HP Jin, took that $1 million and turned it into a public company. So that China investor had a third of a public company, which obviously worked out really well for him. But you rarely you see that experience in the U.S. If you meet someone, you say, hey, I have a cool idea, and then here's $1 million check. Right? Some people, especially in Silicon Valley, not in other states, would give you like a seed, some cases they'll give you like a seed fund of like, hey, here's 25K, 50K. You don't see like, hey, here's $1 million for you. Another example is Gem Play Games, which is another friend's company of mine. He has a gaming company. This is about 6-7 years ago, I think. And he just went to a conference in Korea, and he was just hanging out there. And then he just by chance, just randomly, he met with the CEO of a public company in Korea, and it's a solar company, not even about games. And they had a good discussion, and there were some side stories to that, which I won't go into. But at the end of the day, that CEO also, that company gave him $1 million for his gaming company in the U.S. So again, it's just, you just meet people and they say, hey, here's a check, right? But that obviously doesn't happen all the time, and oftentimes the other things happen, right? Sometimes these investors want you to go to China. They want you they think, again, they value your expertise. They value Western education experience. So they have money, but they don't want to just throw money into the U.S. They want to find these towns and bring these people to China or other Asian nations. And so that's an example of Jiepang, which is, I think, the biggest Foursquare alike in China that my friend started. And so he started his first 2 or 3 businesses in the U.S. And then he got almost attracted to China based on the opportunity, and he raised money there. It's doing pretty well. And then Yodo One is another gaming company where my friend was an entrepreneur here, and he got recruited to China to start this company, Yodo One, and I think it raised close to $10 million. So there's a few examples of how China's mindset of funding is evolving, right? Before they're just like, oh, there's not a lot going around here. The U.S. is great. Let's put money there. And oftentimes it's great because when they invest money, they don't ask a lot of questions because there's like, well, you guys know what you're doing. nowadays they feel like they have more infrastructure there, and so they want to keep their money there and even pull people to that place. Also, in terms of provide environment. So now in a lot of Asian countries, Singapore, China, Taiwan, there are technology parks, just districts, kind of like a Silicon Valley. I guess that's their goal, which is a district that's just about technology, research development, starting businesses, and they give you a lot of perks. I've been personally recruited to a lot of these places. They say, hey, if you come here and start a business here, we'll give you like $350,000 seed funding. We'll give you free space for 2 years. We'll give you, the government will help you here and there. So they're working really hard. They understand the value of bringing entrepreneurs to their space, which is the opposite of my experience here, because Professor Dashan knows that I had a huge amount of struggles with being an entrepreneur here because I didn't have a valid legal status here. I finished school as an international student, and then I had a lot of trouble trying to stay here because there are visas for employees, but there are no visas for entrepreneurs. And so I was on these documentaries about that topic. Also, obviously in Asia, there's also a lot of engineering resources these days, all at a lower cost just because standard of living is lower there. So a lot of them are pushing for US companies to try to outsource their R&D, their development, into China or into Singapore, into Taiwan. And sometimes it makes a lot of sense. There are obviously communication problems. There are time zone problems and communication problems for you. When you're dealing with a different culture, you can never assume they know what you're talking about. It has to be very, very clear. You can think that you're super redundant, but still not be clear enough. Just like for instance, if you don't say you want a logout button, they won't have a logout button, right? It's just you have to say, and if you just say it's a logout button, sometimes they'll say there's a button that says log out, but if you click on it, it does nothing because you did not clarify that the logout button is supposed to log you out of the site. It just says, well, it's a button that says log out on it. Right? You just have to be that clear when you communicate with overseas engineers. But there's a lot of them out there. So every year, China graduates over 1 million engineers, and India 500,000. So at least last time I checked them, I think every year they're graduating more engineers than the U.S. like all of U.S.'s engineers. So obviously, there's a lot of them there. A lot of them are very smart, intelligent. They can develop things that you want. So obviously that creates a shift in the global workplace and economy, right? And again, a lot of them also, before these bigger companies who made a lot of money in Asia, they're also trying to expand into the US now, like Weibo and some bigger gaming companies and whatnot. So they're trying to see if there's ways to acquire companies here. Are there ways to just start an office here? So now you'll start to see more and more of that happening too. So that's my experience and observations on Asia and how it relates to being an entrepreneur here. And hopefully that was useful to you guys.
Great, thank you, Yukai. So why don't you sit down and Jim, Dave, come up and join us. And let's get started with the discussion part of it. So I get to ask the first question. The kind of self-assessment of Silicon Valley is that we are sort of to the whole startup world what Hollywood is to movies. If you really count, you're going to be here. You're really going to be seeing the very best processes of company formation and the very best processes of growth here. Is that a kind of Kool-Aid that everyone drinks here? Should we be looking for other flavors from other places too? And anybody on the panel want to start off with that one?
Me, I know it's not a movie. Sometimes it's R-rated, sometimes X-rated.
You mean the process of starting something up?
It's pretty early, right?
Yeah, but what I mean is that we're really the center of that kind of nature of business. That the valley is where you really ought to come to learn.
So,
go ahead, Yukai.
So I moved here from Los Angeles, and the reason why I moved here was I heard a lot of people talk about how you need to be in Silicon Valley if you're going to be an entrepreneur, and I think it's still very, very valid. And I think it'll be valid for a long time. But obviously, there's a lot more alternatives. So what prompted me to come here was when I was listening to one of won the Stanford Entrepreneur Thought Leadership Series interview or talks. And I remember it was the founder of Google Analytics. And they asked him, hey, how does being in LA help you be an entrepreneur, help you build your startup and sell it to Google? And he says, none. Like, I'm 100% sure if I was in Silicon Valley when I started Google Analytics, from starting to selling to Google, that entire time will be halved, just kind of 50%. And I thought that was really compelling. So I moved here, and I was understanding why that is the case. And I think it is true because there's a lot of infrastructure, the law firms, if people understand startups. Over in LA back then, there's maybe like one startup event every 1 or 2 months, and a lot of them aren't even good. But over here, there's like 20 every week. You can't even go into all of them. So there's a community of understanding. So that has been the case for a long time, but obviously there's a lot of hubs internationally and even in LA and in other states that are still building that. It's not as robust, as sophisticated as Silicon Valley, but it's definitely trying to catch up as quickly as it can.
So I think the panel agrees that Silicon Valley really is a very sophisticated place, and a place where all sorts of resources are available for starting up ventures, right? So why care about Asia? There's the question for the panel session, right?
Would you like me to?
Yeah, anybody. David?
So I think I would start just by saying, yes, as another member of the panel, I agree that Silicon Valley definitely has the technologies for starting companies and some of the resources for doing that. But that doesn't mean it has all the resources you need. And I think you can actually, and I alluded to this perhaps in my comments, but I think there's a risk of falling into Silicon Valley think around how you start a company and what kind of problems are worth working on and what a good company looks like. And so I think there are entrepreneurs and there are ideas that are just a great fit with everything that's here in Silicon Valley right out of the gate, and you don't need to go anywhere else. But I think a lot of the time it can be very helpful to get some other perspectives. And so I think it is generally true when innovating in any way that you're not going to have all the good ideas. You're not going to happen to have all the best ideas and the best resources sitting in your library. It tends to be true with corporate R&D, and that's why we see the rise of open innovation. You don't generally have the best expert in everything in your R&D lab. In the same way, when you're starting a company, the best ideas around some things or sources of capital and other things that you need to draw on may be outside.
Okay. Jim, let me follow through real quickly. You started up Kynded last year, right? Mm-hmm. And so in terms of starting a company this past year versus having started the companies you did earlier, or Yukai, you started companies earlier, do you see changes in the process in the Valley just in the last 2 years, since 2008?
Personally, I think the economy improved, and I think the overall economic investment environment is much better. And that helps when you go out and you pitch and people are not down and out and they don't have that, dark cloud over their head.
Yeah.
But I think that for me, pitching to Silicon Valley investors is still, at least at the very, very early phase, is very difficult because they are short-term thinking and they don't, at least for my kind of project, they just don't take that kind of risk.
Yukai, you're nodding.
About the oftentimes short-term thinking part, but.
So let me rephrase this. I think short-term thinking also may have to do with a clear sense of exit. Mm-hmm. They want to make sure they can get their money out, preferably sooner rather than later, right?
Yes, but that's the short-term thinking part is another conversation in the sense that they usually are interested in what everyone else is interested already in. So and I have friends who work at VC who says that, hey, they rejected a startup because they're crappy in 10 different ways, and then a week later they realize a competitor funded a similar company, and they're like, crap, we need to call them back and fund them, right? But it's like doesn't make any. He himself recognizes like it doesn't make any sense because they're still crappy in those 10 ways, but now we want them, right? So it's just not about they want to see enough traction to the point where they can sell it. But this talk is precisely about that. So to answer your original question, and not talking about the technology trends, I think in the past few years there's the movement towards having a lean startup, right? The lean movement in terms of not raising a ton of money and building up a big thing before you test the market. So I think that's one of the big things. And I think there's a shrinkage in the Series A investor. So there's still growth in seed funders. You can still get a few $100,000s to start your project, and there's a lot of Series B and C investors. Basically, you're growing, you're making a lot of money, and they want to dump more money so you can grow faster and get to an exit. But Series A investors, which are those who say, yo, you have a product, you have early traction, companies who are customers, early customers, they don't, there's a shrinking amount of VC investment in that space because they still feel like this is really risky. It's still far away from the exit that you talked about. And so that part has been shrinking.
Okay. Shall we open the floor? Ed.
Yeah, I just wanted to break open the discussion a little bit by challenging Richard's use of the term Asia. It's like saying United States. There are vast differences. We can name Silicon Valley, then we can name 5 other entrepreneurial, quote, regions, unquote, then we can name Mississippi where there isn't any, and then, et cetera, et cetera. Could the panelists say something about the differences? Asian nations are not one thing. There are many things and they're quite different.
I think that's a very good point, and I would like to open it up. We've got 3 people representing more or less 3 different sort of sectors, right? Japan, Southeast Asia, more or less kind of the China focus for Yukai. Go ahead. What makes those sectors different or distinctive? David?
So Kyoto played a bit part in my presentation, and I dearly love Kyoto, but basically when I talk about Japan, you can substitute Tokyo. So as far as entrepreneurial activity in Japan that I'm aware of generally or that is relevant to our company, it's basically Tokyo. And Tokyo is an incredible cluster, but there's not much outside it as far as entrepreneurship is concerned.
When I was doing, thank you for raising that, when I was doing my online music company, when we talk about Vietnam with the EMI or the Sony or the Universal people, actually they think of Vietnam as Cambodia and Laos, Vietnam plus Singapore, Vietnam plus Malaysia. So is that Southeast Asia neighborhood? That's one market. We don't refer to when we talk about opportunity in Southeast Asia, we don't think of Korea or Japan. It's really Southeast Asia.
That's the marketing side, right? Yeah. Market entry side. In regard to the dynamics of startups, it is very different in different Asia places. One of the things I'd like to comment on is everybody brings their own personal background and kind of, where you've been and the people you know. And to a certain extent, you go with what your strengths are. And I'd like to throw the ball to Yukai and ask you to talk a little bit about what has been distinctive, either culturally from Taiwan or with working with China or whatever.
So and Taiwan and China are very, very different. I'm not talking about politically, but just like entrepreneurial system and structure. Taiwan is a lot more conservative. It's more in the maintenance stage now in its economy. It had its good growth stage about 30 years ago, I think, and so it's doing very lightweight amount of startup technology involvement. But China, on the other hand, is going through explosive growth, and it's recognized itself as the powerhouse. A lot of people are becoming wealthy really quickly without knowing what to do with that money. And also part of it is also they went through the Chinese Revolution, right? Which was really the sense of you need to revolutionize everything. You throw away your books, you do all this stuff. So I think that builds a culture of doing radical things. Like they almost wiped out a decent amount of China's 5,000 years of history, and so. That obviously that's good and bad at the same time in the sense that it allows you to be innovative, allows you to take risks and think about how to create more innovation. Obviously, some people say, "Oh, we lost a big part of our tradition." So when you look at and also Singapore is a country where it's very well maintained, but they're also they're trying, it's very government regulated. It's just government is very active in trying to push forward the economy, and they are very active in making Singapore a very small but very comfortable place to grow an economy and to grow your startup and create engineering staff. So I'd say these are like some of the differences.
So I do want to respond a little bit to Ed, because remember, we've been doing a 9-session series, and the sessions up to today have all really been about what's going on in a particular area. And there is a huge diversity and multicolored nature of the different kind of environments that you'll find in different Asia economies. Today the focus is, what are you bringing from Asia to the Valley, right? What does the Valley gain out of what's going on in Asia? Not so much what's going on in Asia, but I don't want this to look like we're trying to paint everything with the same brush, right? It really isn't. Things are very different in an economy where the average, income per person is really higher than the United States, because Singapore is at least $20,000 higher average individual income than the U.S. is, versus a place like, China or even Southeast Asia, where there's still an awful lot of room to grow before you get up to U.S. income per person. Let's open the floor again.
Hi, my name is Eric. I'm with a local angel group, but more in the life science area, the life science angels. Just want to comment firstly about the Series A. I think the angel groups realize that there is that big gap, so the Angel Capital Association trying to syndicate a lot more to fill that gap, but there is a problem. The part I want to ask about the panel is with a lot of these science parks, these incubators, not happening just in Asia, but built locally. What's your, I guess, impression of these? Or have you dealt with them previously?
Are you referring to Y Combinator types or co-working spaces?
Both.
I'd say that the co-working space is the incubator, Y Combinator type is an accelerator. Okay, let's put a definition on it. Panelists?
I didn't have much experience in Vietnam with incubator type.
Is that because you didn't need them?
Because we didn't need them, and it was more for like local companies.
I tend to think, personally, that the resource availability in Silicon Valley means that you really have to have a pretty exceptional program to be successful as something like Y Combinator, just because if you don't need it, why bother? Yeah. Let me ask you, are you getting people from outside the Valley community who want to join the angel group?
Yes. You mean as angel members or?
Right. Either as investors or as mentors, or somehow be involved with your angel group, and they're coming from Asia or not really resident here in the Valley.
We do have a lot of folks with Asian background.
Okay.
That's more like came over.
But people live here.
Yeah. More difficult if you actually live in Asia, because how would fly every month to attend a dinner meeting?
Yeah.
Or if you have a teleconference area, it just makes it challenging. But there is more partnership in that sense.
Yeah, that was a point about dealing with Asia investors, right? How do you handle the long distance nature of business relationships with Asia?
Especially when you're 15 hours behind, it just makes calling them extremely.
Or they call you on Skype.
Oh yeah.
In odd hours.
So for the incubator accelerator programs, I think they were extremely positive here, because it almost feels like you're an entrepreneur, you start your first business, but you're not in the wild anymore. It's almost like startup school, right? Because before, you're used to your corporate environment, and things are set there. But when you start a company, you're like, wow, everything is different. Like everything's a variable. What can I do? So you have to figure out every single little block. But in an incubator program, at least it gives you more structure about, these are the straightforward. These are straightforward. So you just have to worry about creating value for customers, building a product, and having that community. I think that is very positive. Obviously, with a more prominent one like Y Combinator, once you graduate, you immediately come with some seed funding because, again, foreign investors from Russia and other places, they just say, hey, every class who graduates from Y Combinator, I'm going to put a little bit of money into them, right? And so maybe that's going to happen for Asian investors also, not sure. And then the co-working spaces, those are, obviously not as powerful, but they just allow entrepreneurs to have, to build a community. Again, it's just feeling that you're not out there doing it by yourself. And I think even in Silicon Valley, without those, when you start a company, it's still very lonely, right? It's still, you're just working by yourself and you don't know what you're doing and you don't know what's the next step or what's going to happen. And obviously that's the same for everywhere. So it's good to have that community of people who are in the same shoes as you are and taking the same risks.
Let me follow through with a kind of different question. This is sort of different cultural patterns of doing business. I'd like to ask each panelist, starting with David, how do different, say, business culture issues impact the way you're going to localize your product here than in Asia? For moduleQ. The whole sense of how groups work in Japan is very different than it is here. And the same thing for Jim, right? With Kynded, you're going to have different kind of dynamics going on. Yukai and the whole gamification space, how do you handle cultural differences? David, why don't you go first?
So with the disclaimer that we haven't yet started localizing our technology for Japan, what we find is that Japanese organizations tend to be very focused on risk avoidance and control. And so we have strong interest from a large Japanese bank in our product. When US companies look at our technology, generally they're looking at, gee, this could make our individual knowledge workers a lot more productive, and it could give us better management analytics so we could start seeing into the processes that we manage. When I talk to Japanese organizations, it tends to be much more along the lines of, gee, we had somebody accidentally CC somebody that they shouldn't have, and the CEO had to go and apologize for this internal information being sent to the wrong person. If we could use moduleQ to control who sees what and where things go, that would be great. They also tend to be, Japanese organizations are generally very concerned about yuchaku, about sort of incestuous relationships with suppliers and so forth. And so the banks routinely rotate their sales reps. So the sales rep shifts accounts every 2 years. And that's highly disruptive to the business, right? If you've been dealing with one person for your sales account and this is commercial lending, these are big loans, and you're rotating everyone every 2 years. And if you're doing it with email, how do you move that work in progress? Okay, I'll forward everything from my inbox, right? And so something like moduleQ could give you control over processes like that. So yeah, the organizations function very differently, but the limitations of email as a process management tool are still there.
Okay. Jim?
Our first investor, seed investor, Kynded, is from Vietnam, and he's a major furniture manufacturer there. And I was really intrigued when he said he wanted to invest, because I know that in our culture, in my culture, the art of saying thank you is quite formal, whereas in Kynded, we want to make the thank you process fun, simple, and quick. But in the Asian culture, especially in the Vietnamese culture, saying thank you is like, it's a huge weight in your shoulder. How you say it, your facial expression, when you say it, it's very elaborate, right? And so I was very intrigued when he said, well, how can you simplify this process so that can work for our culture, for the Vietnamese culture? And I was quite proud of that. And we came up with ways to simplify this, but I think that when we launch, we'll know for sure if we have the right way, and that is, we have to make the process really easy, but the UI UX interface for that particular audience has to be done right so that it works for that particular market.
Just a brief follow-up on your business model. You're actually going to have ways of saying thank you that are essentially monetary rewards that you can do online?
It's free, but
okay.
The third tier of our thing is recognize, record, and reward. So you recognize the kind act, and you record the kind act using your mobile phone, and the last is you reward, meaning if Richard did something nice, I said, hey, thanks for helping me. Here's a $20 Starbucks gift card for you for helping me. Richard can say that, he can take that, I can send it to him, and I get Kynded makes a percentage from that transaction, right? But if Richard said, hey, don't worry about it, Jim, I just want to help you out, why don't you give that $20 to Salvation Army or the Goodwill, okay? So that $20 can also go to a charitable organization, and we don't make any money from that. That goes to a nonprofit organization.
Okay, okay. We talked a little bit at lunch the other day about how this would fit very well, the whole idea of giving gifts back once you receive gifts in Asian cultures.
Could do a great business in government.
No comment. Yukai, what about gamification, cultural differences in gamification?
So the nice thing about, again, gamification is really learning from games applying to productive activities. The nice thing about games is that it's pretty global, it's pretty international, right? Every nation that has the luxury to play games, they usually fall, like there's a huge amount of people who fall in love with games, and it's not just young males, but for instance, in the U.S., there's actually more women over 30 playing games than males under 20. But obviously the details of how you create a game will sometimes a little different in different places. So I think what's useful is, and going back to the framework Octalysis, right? It breaks down 8 core drives. So those 8 core drives are relevant everywhere. So for instance, like epic meaning and calling, you're doing something that's because of something that's bigger than yourself, right? You're like Wikipedia. You're contributing to Wikipedia not because you are making money or building a resume. You're contributing to Wikipedia because you feel like you're protecting humanity's knowledge. Or empowerment of creative feedback. Like everywhere, people do want to feel like, hey, I can utilize my creativity and I want to see feedback of it. So there's some adjustments. Like some cultures say, hey, if you're a worker, you don't want to, you should just work hard. You don't necessarily need to have ownership of full ownership over something, or you don't necessarily need to be empowered with creativity. But I think innately all human beings want these things. It's just you have to kind of understand each culture, how they're a little bit different, and be very sensitive to it. And
yeah, just real quick follow-up. Octalysis.com or .org? What's the website?
Octalysis.com can get you there.
Yeah, it's a very good website. Octalysis.com. Okay. Floor is open. Go ahead.
So, Jim, you had mentioned HEP, high emotion personal investment from angels. That's not very compatible generally with angel investment. The idea being that one description here in Silicon Valley is that angel investing is like burning money. And so that's not very compatible with somebody looking to store their money in a safe, stable investment that's likely to return. That's a treasury fund, not an angel investment. So how do you bridge that and explaining that to those investors who may or may not be sophisticated?
To me, the hippie profile applies probably in the first couple meetings with these guys, is they are highly charged because they connect with you personally, there's some commonality between what I've gone through and what they have gone through, for example. And so I've been pretty successful in terms of making that linkage, making that connection with them in that first couple of meetings. Yes, the idea that make sure my investment is safe, that's always there. But the hippie part comes in very early, and if we can qualify them at that early stage and get them to commit because they connect with you, because there's some emotional connection, there's some personal connection, then I think that helps compensate for the, make sure my money is safe part.
They do understand.
They do understand. They do understand. And actually, as you go through the negotiation with them, when you close and all that in the terms, that's when, they take their sword out and it gets down to, them sitting with the lawyer and making sure that, here are the specific terms that they want. Right.
Go ahead.
I just want to comment briefly because my experience in dealing with Japanese investors has been very different from the comments on dealing with Chinese investors. And I don't know if that is one of these cultural differences, or if it's, that in Silicon Valley there are lots of different people with different investment styles. But what I have found is that generally when we're talking about investments in people who are either Japanese or have really strong Japan connections, they tend to be oriented around long relationships. And so almost all of these investments come from people that I have long relationships with, meaning 10 years or more in many cases, and that when there's not a long relationship, it's a very trusted introduction from someone that there's one of those relationships with. I've found those investors to be very dry, so anything but the emotional model. They know me, they look at the business plan, they make a pretty cut and dried decision, and there's never any negotiation on terms.
I have a question on that. I've heard a lot in Silicon Valley. It's unique where people are more accepted of failures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in Japan, when you raise some money from someone you've known for 10 years, they trust you as a person, long-term relationship, and if the entrepreneur loses the money, does that burn the relationship, or they're like, okay, that was a good run?
In almost all of these cases, perhaps all, when we're talking about Japanese nationals, these are people who have had lots of international experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it'd be very rare that you'd find sort of a traditional Japanese mainline domestic business millionaire willing to take risky investments in Silicon Valley, and there are more traditional Japanese individuals that I know who are wealthy, from whom I have not solicited money because I suspect that they might not deal well with that.
I think there's also a difference between early stage versus later stage. At the early stage, you're really talking about more personal investments, period, no matter whether you're talking about an angel here or you're talking about going to an angel somewhere else. At the later stage, venture capital in Asian countries tends to be more from a financial standpoint than it does from a strategic technology analysis standpoint. And I do think that difference still persists. To the extent that sometimes it's hard to demonstrate something, it's hard to get people to buy something unless you can show a relatively early return in Asia.
I think you'd have a very hard time raising a Series A or a Series B or a Series C in Japan unless you have Silicon Valley funds on board.
Yeah. Okay. What should the Valley worry about in the future? This is the last question for the day. Should we be concerned that we're going to lose something about the special nature of the Valley? Should we be looking at Asia for anything? Is Asia a good partner? Is Asia an upcoming competitor? What should our attitude be here?
I'm worried I'm talking too much here. I feel like the biggest concern is really talent drain. I think, again, not just Asia, all the other countries are aggressively recruiting entrepreneurs to go to their country and start businesses. And in the U.S. has been working relentlessly hard to stop entrepreneurs from working here, right? That's a huge story for me. But so that's one thing, right? I mean, what makes Silicon Valley unique is not the infrastructure, not the building, it's the people, it's the entrepreneurs. It's because it has a brand name where entrepreneurs travel here to start businesses and to support each other, and the investors are here. But if that reverses, where the entrepreneurs all want to go somewhere else, then obviously Silicon Valley is just a place with buildings, right, and roads.
Do you think that's likely?
I won't say that it will just suddenly become something different, but as a trend, it could 10, 20 years later become something that it doesn't want to be. And also we look at for engineering resources too, right? It's just staying relevant because now it's a global competitive market, and I feel like part of that is just really knowing what you're good at. And when globalization is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just more about now you have to really understand what you do best and focus on that. And
your point of reference is now global instead of just what you can see around you.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to ask Jim to go next.
Sure.
For me, I think we have all the ingredients here to last a while, but we need to continue making this place accessible and open to everybody, make it easy for them to come here. And I think one of the things our government did very well is the EB-5 program, make it easier for overseas investors to invest here and get their money back, and they get the green card and all that.
Yeah, this is new. When is this coming into effect?
I think it's already
It is in effect now.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
already in effect.
okay.
It's doing quite well, actually.
Plus, a lot more green cards are coming.
But you have to have at least 220K in
500.
right?
500K.
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 For Silicon Valley, you need $1 million,
And
actually.
no,
Yeah.
no lean startup, right?
So that blocks out most Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who are young people out of school to
And there will be an increase in the number of green cards. I think you're right.
Read the stuff that Warren Patches in the Senate wrote
Okay.
about green cards.
Okay.
Like John Hennessy talking about stapling green cards to everybody's degree. It's going to happen.
Okay. David.
So I think I would tend to agree with those on the panel and in the audience who are more sanguine on the human resources dimension, in part because in starting our company here, one of the things we've recognized is that particularly for IT-related, internet-related talent, and to a lesser extent, venture law and intellectual property, but especially technology talent. The epicenter is in San Francisco, and it's snowballing, if anything. So it's more and more attracted there. So what I worry most about is the financial capital taps being turned off, because if you look at the distribution of capital, venture capital around the world, in very rough numbers, according to our friends at PwC, it's a third in Silicon Valley, and it fluctuates a certain amount over the years, but a third in Silicon Valley, a third in the rest of the United States, and a third in the rest of the world. If you think about that for a moment, the size of this geography and the share of global venture capital that is concentrated here, it's outrageously out of proportion, and it more than explains the way that we've been able to create virtuous cycles here. But my understanding, and I would defer to experts on this, is that venture capital returns have not been so great. IPO is getting a lot harder, or has gotten a lot harder post the dot bomb that Jim mentioned earlier. And as a result, the institutional money that has fed this virtuous cycle of entrepreneurial activity is tapering off. And I don't know how significant that tapering is. Perhaps it's not something to be worried about. But if I were going to worry about anything, that would be it.
Okay. I have a couple of thank yous I want to say. I want to say thank you first to Tiffany, our course assistant, to Sejin, who has done all the advertising for this and making sure these happen. I want to say thanks to all of you, both students who've registered for credit, because without students we wouldn't be doing this, and also those of you who've come, week after week for a lot of our regulars. We're really delighted that you found value in these and are very happy that you've come. I want to say thanks to our sponsors. Major series support for this came from ISI Dentsu, and Jim is in the audience today, so we'll be sure and say hi. Also thank the Alan Miner Foundation for support of this series. And certainly I'd like to join everybody in saying thanks to a panel of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs to keep all of this in perspective. Thank you, gentlemen.